which I think it was a great change done by Maria Theresa. But I have a daughter at home, and sometimes she's complaining about that because they have learned at school that thanks to Maria Theresa she has to go to school, and sometimes she doesn't like this fact. But I think it was a really good change that the girls, they have the same opportunities as the boys, and they can also study and go to universities and so on. But then the son of Maria Theresa, Joseph II, he started even more of the reforms, and some of his reforms were more popular than the others, especially around the Bohemian Kingdom. So one of the really good reform was that he stopped the serfdom. You have to imagine until late 1700s people were the serfs. So they had to work for the kings, noble, churches, monasteries and so on. They really didn't have the freedom, and this was changed by Joseph II when people became free and they could start moving from place to place and choose their jobs. So one of the good reforms, but the other reforms, especially around the Bohemian Kingdom, were not as popular. First of all, he was doing some of the reforms around religion. So he was closing a lot of churches and monasteries to save money because it was too expensive for the Habsburgs. And then he was also forcing people to be Catholic. So at the time of the Habsburgs, people had to be Catholic, and we had quite a lot of the Protestants living around the Bohemian Kingdom. So that wasn't definitely only German. And even though we were occupied during the century by so many different countries, we managed to keep our language till today, so we still speak Czech. But one of the ways they managed to keep the language back then, at the time of Joseph II, was through the marionettes shows, or the puppet shows. You are going to see quite a lot of the marionettes, puppets around Cesky Krumlov. We have a puppet museum in town, and a lot of the shops, they sell them. And the reason why the puppets or the marionettes are so popular around the Czech Republic is that really at the time of Joseph II, when they were playing with the marionettes, that was the only time when they could, till today. So even sometimes today I get a question if one day maybe we are going to switch to German, since we are surrounded by the German-speaking countries. But I don't think this is ever possible. If you really manage to keep the language till today, being occupied by so many different countries, we love to speak Czech, and we just are proud to be Czechs. Even though the Czech language is really difficult, it's not an easy language. It has a really difficult grammar. For example, we have 7 cases, and it's just really hard for the kids when they are learning a lot of the exceptions and so on. But it's a beautiful language, and it's similar to Polish, Russian, Yugoslavian, Croatian, and also Slovak. As I'll be talking about, we used to be one country, Czechoslovakia, so of course Slovak language is really similar to Czech language. So these are the similar languages to ours. So, and then during the 1800s, the country was growing quite a bit because the Habsburgs, they were opening a lot of the companies around the Bohemian Kingdom. So the country was doing quite well with the companies. But then there was World War, when 1.5 million Czechs were fighting for the Habsburg monarchy, early 1900s. And at the end of the First World War in 1918, we became the first independent democratical country in Central Europe. First from England, where he spent the First World War, and then also from the US, because he was at the time when they were making the decisions about the country in the US. So a lot of the first decisions about Czechoslovakia were actually made from the US. And the country was doing quite well, thanks to the companies that were open earlier around the Bohemian Kingdom. So Czechoslovakia was growing, believe me, before the Second World War started. But unfortunately, this was really stopped by the Second World War, which started quite early for us, because it started in 1938 by the Munich Agreement. The Munich Agreement was the decision made about us, without us, when we were given to Hitler by France and England, because they believed he's not going to start the war, which didn't help. And if you imagine the borders of the Czech Republic, they kind of shrunk, went inland, and Hitler got the areas along the Austrian, German and Polish border. Those were the areas where there were quite a lot of the Germans living, and they were trying to get independent even before the Second World War started, but they were not successful when Hitler took over by the Munich Agreement. So these were the changes. In 1938, the Munich Agreement was the end of September 1938, and you have to imagine that it was a really hard time for Czechoslovakia at that country because all of the homes of the Czechs were confiscated by the Germans, and the Czechs, they were forced to leave their homes. So they had to find some friends, relatives, whoever would take them, and that's where they spent the Second World War. Then the Second World War started officially for Czechoslovakia the 1st of September 1939. And we were really occupied by Hitler, by Nazis, and it was a really tough time for the whole country when the Second World War started. I'll get back to the history through the Second World War just in a little while, because now we are entering a little town or village still on the Austrian side, and there is an interesting connection between the Czech Republic and Austria, because in the 1800s they built the oldest horse railway on the old continent. There was an older one in England, but this continent, and it was a connection between Cesky and Linz. Cesky is a big town next to Cesky Krumlov, only about 20 minutes from there, and that's where the horse railway was started, and it went all the way to Linz. The length of the horse railway was about 130 kilometers, about 80 miles, and it's pretty much the same length as we are driving today. And back then the journey on the horse railway took 14 hours. So we are so lucky to be on this luxury coach, because for us it's going to be an hour and a half so on the bus. So we are really lucky, but back then the journey on the train really took much longer. And just around one corner we are going to see on the right hand side a wooden wagon filled with the wooden logs, and that's what the horse railway was about. So they used to pull these wooden wagons back then. So we'll make a little stop, and actually there's a traffic jam anyway. So here on the right hand side you can see the wooden wagon filled with the wooden logs. So the wooden logs were mainly transferred from the Czech side, from the Bohemian forest. So that's what they were bringing over here to Austria. What was coming the other way from Austria to Bohemia was salt, because we don't have any salt mines. So all of the salt was coming from the Salzburg area mainly, and it was really important for our country to the Czech Republic from Austria. First they were transferring only goods between the two countries, but then later on they started to transfer people as well. So really the journey for people that back then took 14 hours. So they would start at about 5 o'clock from Cesky and from Linz, and then we'll be driving by a spot where there was a station where they met, and they had 1 hour lunch break over there, and they changed the trains, and then they continued to either side. So this was the horse railway. The existence of the horse railway wasn't too long because then the steam engine was started later in the 1800s, and then they stopped using the horses for pulling these trains, so it wasn't here very long. But this wasn't even the oldest connection between the two countries, because there was an older connection between Austria and the Bohemian Kingdom. It was called the Schwarzenberg Canal. You are going to hear the name Schwarzenberg and Cesky Krumlov because they were one of the owners of the castle over there. And they built this canal from the forests on the Czech side, and it was connected to Danube. So they would transfer a lot of the wooden logs to Danube. Companies and houses were heated by the Czech wood early 1800s. So when driving through the countryside, you can later on, when we cross the border, compare the fields. Because over here in Austria, they have beautiful tradition of the family private farming, and till today, so you can really see how the fields are divided into smaller ones. When we cross the border, our fields in the Czech Republic look much bigger because our private farming was spoiled, destroyed by the Communist Party shortly after the Second World War. During the 50s and 60s, we went through a large collectivization when a lot of the land, or most of the land, was taken away from the farmers and even their houses, and they built or they made these huge cooperative farms back then. And even though we went through a large restitution when a lot of the land was returned back to the original owners, after the regime broke 28 years ago, then a lot of these people were not the farmers anymore, and so they kept the fields in the hands of the larger farms. They are really often the shareholders, and so the fields in the Czech Republic just look different compared to the Austrian side. So really here, if the farmers have some animals, cows for example, for milking, then they might have 10, 20 cows the max. The Czech farms, they have few hundreds usually, so the farms on the Czech side look different and they are much bigger. But the crops they grow is really similar, so it's a lot of the wheat, all kinds of different wheat. Corn you can see on our left hand side. It's mainly for the animals. It's not the sweet corn to eat, but it's mainly for the animals. And then you are going to see beautiful fields of the poppy seeds, the poppy seeds, because Austria and the Czech Republic, we are the biggest producers of poppy seeds in whole Europe, because we use it for cooking, for the sweet cuisine especially, and for baking, for pastries. So you are going to see some of the fields of the poppy seeds, and also along the way you might see some fields of potatoes. So that would be also one of the crops that is grown in this area. So to return back to the history around the Second World War. So really the situation in Czechoslovakia or in the Czech Republic wasn't too good because we got occupied by the Nazis, by Hitler. They were all around the country, and Cesky Krumlov was part of the Sudetenland, so we'll be talking more about it. But during the Second World War we had quite a large population of Jewish, so a lot of the Jewish ended up in concentration camps, in the working camps. The gypsies were dying as well in the concentration camps because Hitler didn't like them, and then of course he didn't like Czechs very much, so a lot of the Czechs were dying during the Second World War as well. So there were people that were trying to fight against Hitler, but mainly from the other side, so a lot of the people tried to emigrate from the country. And for example, the Czech pilots, they were fighting from England for Czechoslovakia, and there were other tryings for the country, but it was quite hard, and it wasn't really easy life during the Second World War in the Czech Republic. A lot of the pilots that returned back to Czechoslovakia after the Second World War, they ended up in prison because for some reason the communists didn't like them. They thought that they are too dangerous because they knew too much of I don't know what exactly, but that's why they put them into prison. So just kind of hard life. The Second World War ended in 1945 for Czechoslovakia, and what I was taught at school when I was a child, it was that we got liberated by Russians only. They were lying to us back then, because parts of Czechoslovakia were liberated by the American army as well. So for example, Cesky Krumlov was liberated by the Americans, the west part of Czechoslovakia. There was the agreement between the American army and the Russian army how far the Americans can get, so they couldn't continue any further. It didn't matter after all very much, because we got under the control of the Russians anyway after the Second World War. So officially from 1948 the Communist Party started to rule Czechoslovakia. So during that time we had elections, but there was only one party to vote for, so really not democratical life in Czechoslovakia, and we were living behind the Iron Curtain for 40 years. Sometimes people ask why we call it the Iron Curtain. It was really the Iron Curtain. So there was a high fence at the border with the soldiers guarding, and we were not allowed to come any closer to the border because the soldiers, they were ready to shoot anybody who got closer to the border. So we were really living in Czechoslovakia, not able to travel much. So it was really hard life again. So not only during the Second World War, but again afterwards, because we didn't have the freedom. And as I mentioned, during the 50s and 60s, the land was confiscated from people. and they made these large cooperative farms. The idea was that people won't own anything, everything will be owned by the government, so there was no private business in Czechoslovakia. Everybody was employed during that time, so for 40 years we didn't have any private business in Czechoslovakia. The Communist Party decided to change this a little in 1968 when we had this Prague Spring, which some of you might know. So they were trying to make the country more democratical and opening the borders and changing the life for people a little, but unfortunately the Russians came to rescue us in August 1968. That's what they say. They came to rescue us from the freedom and from the democratical life. So again, it got really strict when the Russians got into the country, and we had the tanks in the squares, and the borders really shut down then, and it got really the Velvet Revolution when finally the borders opened, and the life really changed for our country. So we call it the Velvet Revolution. University students in Prague, and it was happening at the same time as the Berlin Wall and the other Eastern countries changing the regime. And for us, really was started by the university students that started to strike against the Communist Party. And it was really mild. People were not dying, and that's why we call it the Velvet Revolution. So I remember the company stopped working as well. So my parents, they were working in a paper mill, so the paper mill stopped working, and my parents were striking in the streets as well. For me, I was 12 years old in 1989, and I went to school. The way of strikes of the teachers was they came to school, but they were not teaching. So for at least 2 weeks, we were only chatting with the teachers, and we were not getting any homework. So I have really positive memories about the revolution, that's for sure. Being a child, to be honest, I really didn't know what's going on. I really didn't understand what was going on, because I didn't know anything else. It was my life I was living, and if you don't know it, you don't miss it. So for me, it was just normal life, what I was living through. And of course, today, being older, have learned the history and have traveled, I know that the life we were living wasn't the right thing, what the communists were doing around the country. But back then, I really didn't understand it. So it was big change, and I was only watching TV and trying to get it, what was going on. And we are crossing the Austrian border here, so pretty soon we are going to make the stop for using the bathroom here. But back then, what I remember is that here there were long lines at the border, because we all wanted to see what it is like on the other side. So they were checking the passports properly, and I remember these long lines at first. So I'll get back to this part of the history, because I'll tell you a few stories about living through socialism and crossing the border and the impression of the country when we crossed the border. But now we are going to stop at the fuel station here. It's going to be a short break only for using the bathroom, which is free of charge. There's a casino on the right-hand side, but no time for gambling, okay? Unless you want to be picked up on the way back. But come to Cesky Krumlov, you are going to enjoy that, I'm sure. And it's quite traffic jam because of the trucks. But we'll have to walk around the building to the front. That's where the bathroom is. It's the next... the bathroom is next to the little shop, so you don't have to get into the shop to get to go into the bathroom. And if you would like to then buy some refreshments or some treats, it is also to the Czech side. And to get back to what I was trying to talk about, when the regime broke, they opened the borders, and I remember these long lines, because we were really collecting the stamps. They were really checking the cars a lot when we were crossing the borders in 1989, right after it opened. So they would really check it first on the Czech side and then on the Austrian side as well. And then we were really impressed when we came to Austria, because it was beautifully maintained. Everything was really clean. The houses were fixed. Over here, because everything was confiscated from the people, then the land was owned by the government, the houses as well. So they just didn't have the power and money to maintain it all. And that's the reason why it was kind of dirty and falling apart a lot. And for us, it was really impressive when we crossed the border. Today, you don't see such huge differences anymore, but back then definitely the difference was there, and we really enjoyed that. We were really afraid that somebody is going to talk to us when we came to Austria, because we didn't speak the language, because during the socialism we were learning Czech as a mother tongue, and then we were learning Russian. as a foreign language. So that was our foreign language back then. And then we really enjoyed the things in the shops because we didn't have the things. So we were looking around the shops, but we couldn't buy much because the salaries over here were really little. I sometimes say that people were pretending to work and they were pretending to be paid during socialism because the salaries were way too little. And so it was really different. So for us, we really enjoyed the things but couldn't buy it because it was just way too expensive. I'm not going to comment the Sin City though. Look on the other side, you might see there are cows on the other side. Beautiful, it's really beautiful farms and the trees and everything. So we really like that, and I'll tell you a few stories about the long lines and shopping in Czechoslovakia. When I was growing up, I made a joke that the line at the bathroom, you'll experience what we were living through, because when I was growing up, then our shops were pretty much empty. I can't say I ever suffered from hunger. During 80s, when I was growing up, we always had food, but it was real limited because it was mainly the products from Czechoslovakia. We didn't have import coming into the country. My parents always had a garden and we had some animals, so we definitely had food, so I wasn't suffering from not having food. But the other things, it was really a challenge. So buying clothing, electronic things for the house, it was really difficult. So when I was about 7 years old, my parents decided to buy me a bicycle. And you have to imagine, it wasn't there in the shop. So it was always good to have friends that were working in the shop. So somebody told us they are going to bring the bikes. So there was a long line in front of the shop, and me and my mom, we were one of the first ones waiting in the line. And then they brought 2 bikes for the whole town. So my mom had to fight, and she won. I got it. So she's really good. And then when I was about 10 years old, then my parents decided to buy the first freezer for the house because we really had the garden and we had some animals. And again, it wasn't there in the shop. So somebody told us they are going to bring the freezers. So my father was sleeping for 2 nights in front of the shop in the car. And it was during our summer vacation. So me and my brother, we had to take turns during the day to be the first ones in the line. I'll still remember how worried I was that they'll bring the freezers when my parents were at work. It didn't happen, it was in the afternoon. But then after 2 days when they brought the freezers, it wasn't the one my parents wanted. So it repeated again after a month. And then finally we got the freezer for the house. And then I mentioned my father was sleeping in the car. He had a car. My parents, they got their first car early 70s. It was Škoda, produced in the Czech Republic. And my father was on a waiting list for a long time before getting this car. And then he had to be waiting in front of the factory when the car was coming out, because who wasn't waiting there? It was skipped, and another person on the waiting list would get it. So when I was growing up, we had a car at home, but we didn't use it much. It was only for the really long trips. So this car lasted more than 20 years, and then my